Hi, my name is Miranda Henry, and this is my article presentation for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. The article I summarized and am presenting today is a study published in 2014 by Yulia Lovcha and Alejandro Perez Laborda. I apologize for the mispronunciation of the author's names, but the article is titled The Hours Worked Productivity Puzzle, Identification in a Fractional Integration Setting. They hypothesized that in a meta-analysis of several studies looking at productivity in relation to technology shocks, they would find that the data would contradict the technology-driven business cycle hypothesis. With this, they are looking at both short-term and long-term data in relation to their variables. So hours worked and productivity closer to a technology shock versus a couple years out from the technology shock. There's a couple of key terms that I'd like to clarify before we really get into it. First of all, a technology shock is a sudden change in technology that significantly affects an outcome of a economic, social, political, or otherwise oriented situation. Specifically in this case, what they're looking at is an economic technology shock, which refers to an event in a real business cycle model that changes the production function. And then the next thing I'd like to define is the real business cycle theory. This is an economic theory that looks at the forces behind supply and demand as different events or culture shocks that are responsible for the fluctuations in the economy. Specifically, it assumes that technological change causes fluctuation in the individual's reasoning, which leads to changes in our levels of labor supply and consumption on a broader scale. This theory provides the theoretical responses, which they are then able to compare the meta-analysis data against in order to prove their hypothesis by contradicting said theory. So in their introduction, their article looks at the productivity levels in relation to the number of hours worked. This study is particularly examining the spike in worked hours due to a technology shock, still resulting in less productivity. They bring up that other studies have assumed that hours worked are lessened when a technology shock happens, which they then indicate is not the case based upon the empirical evidence. So theoretically, that technology shock should be bringing down hours worked and up productivity, but it actually backfires both directions, is what they're saying. The analysis looked at 5 different data sets with a relaxed assumption on reduced hours comparatively to other studies. The research is based upon an analysis of short-term and long-term data to come up with an accurate conclusion. In the long term, a technology shock has shown decreases in hours worked. However, the short term always shows an increase in hours worked. They then go into how they're going to be kind of like leveling out the data because the different studies use either fractionally integrated or VARs for their analysis. And And so for them to put all of the data together, they basically have to merge the two formulas in order to analyze it. They additionally look at where the variations are when looking at the long-term and the short-term data so that they can sort that out into two separate categories as well. The response of hours worked to a technology shock and simulation study. This section looks at the data of 5 different studies. The researchers are analyzing and applying the determined formulas in order to find out the hours worked in relation to the technology shock. They find, contrary to the real business cycle predictions, the long-term effects of a technology shock actually result in a decrease of hours worked. In the simulation study, they examine the variable of technology shock being something that is assumed based upon employee identification and how it might be impacting the conclusions. So then, in their conclusion, what they did find, with the assumption of relaxing the assumed variables, and when examining the data, they found a significant difference in results from a technology shock in the short term and the long term. In the short term, there was an increase in hours worked, while in the long term, there was a decrease in hours worked. They found a large variance in the different samples utilized for the study, which is important to bring up because that variance kind of decreases the impact the study can really have for us, right? Basically, there are some like confounding variables that made it a difficult analysis, and that's where they kind of write this off too. They discussed the differences found in studies utilized, possibly contributing these differences to not accurately pulling apart their long-term and short-term results. They concluded that with the differences in the study, they had gathered significant evidence against the real business cycle. Lastly, they discussed the limitations of the analysis as differences in the long-term and short-term. They also mentioned how the differences in wages across the studies could be a confounding variable, but that they still found the data immediately contradicts the real business cycle predictions of what they would be seeing versus what they were seeing. Basically they found what they wanted to find for the short term and they didn't for the long term. And then they kind of gave a couple of excuses regarding it, saying it could be due to the wage gaps or, memory issues, not remembering things correctly. Like they've mentioned long memory a number of times. All in all, wonderful study. We'll be using it for my literature review. Thanks for listening.